Welcome back. So in this video, and which is the final video of our discussion of network strategy, we're going to talk about clusters. Clusters have a very special meaning close to my heart. I remember when I was a first-year Ph.D. student, I wrote my first paper. I stayed up many late nights to finish it, and I turned it in, and it was actually about clusters. And I was talking about the fact that clusters are one way to secure firms within a network against the poaching behaviors of imitation that you may find in developing countries. That was the thesis of my paper. And I will never forget that the professor told me that my paper was offensive, lacked a basic understanding of economics, and read more like populist propaganda than academic research. And he very quickly told me that my definition in that paper of clusters was not a cluster, but rather it was an economic center. So every time I think of clusters, I remember that first paper, and I remember staying home during my Christmas break instead of coming back to the US and spending it with my family, staying in a very cold dorm room to redo my paper to this professor's satisfaction. So every professor, including Dr. D, has made mistakes, and mine was around clusters. I'll never forget it. Anyhow, let's talk about a definition of cluster. Now, the classic definition is it's a geographically proximate group of interconnected companies and institutions that have both commonalities and complementarities. I think now that we have more and more business done over internet, things like Skype, FaceTime, Google Docs, etc., I think the geographical component is becoming less important. You think about why. You may have a very special relationship with one of the call centers that does customer service for you, and that group may be in India. But you have such a tight relationship with them, you work with them all the time, you're in contact with them all the time, you may never even met those people in India. But they are working with you and you become so close to them that, in my opinion, they will be part of your particular cluster, especially if they're servicing all of Silicon Valley or a very large number of firms in Silicon Valley. So I think it's the network piece, that the closest of the relationship, that's becoming more important than geography, at least in contemporary business. You're free to disagree with me on that if you like. Either way, clusters always tend to benefit from what we call agglomeration economies, meaning there's going to be more or greater productivity and flexibility tied to the presence of large pools of specialized laborers and suppliers. Again, you think about Silicon Valley. Lots and lots of tech-oriented people will go to Silicon Valley to work, and if they get fired from one firm, no big deal. They'll switch off to another firm in the area. There are plenty of opportunities in Silicon Valley for people with those given skill sets. Okay? And of course, it also tends to attract very competent, qualified people in Silicon Valley. So you get high productivity and flexibility. There's also a lot of cost sharing. Okay? Certain things require, very high fixed costs, and in clusters, these fixed costs can be shared between firms. Okay? So for example, in Silicon Valley, it would make sense for a variety of software companies to maybe go into a joint venture to launch some sort of maybe a hardware firm that could serve as a hardware company that could produce hardware which would be used for that given software. So several firms can get together to launch that new joint venture, and of course that joint venture could, of course, with different arrangements, also service other firms in the Silicon Valley area. Again, it helps when you're all kind of close together. And of course, generally speaking, we think that there's greater quality and innovation because of the fact that there is a lot of know-how and transfer and spillover effects. When you've got a lot of people from a lot of different firms, but they're all kind of doing the same thing, or they're at least in the same organizational field, in other words, they're all kind of stakeholders with each other, people are out, they get to talking, they meet people, they exchange ideas over dinner, chit-chatting at the coffee shop, the local news. I mean, it kind of creates this massive kind of culture towards whatever industry is in a given cluster. Now we talk about there's kind of different kinds of clusters. There are ones that just kind of arise. Silicon Valley, that was just kind of a, I mean, it was, of course, had a lot to do with the fact that Stanford was there and stuff, but it almost kind of arose by accident. And you find the same thing with the Boston Health Cluster. I mean, you've got a lot of higher learning institutions in Boston. They kind of tended to support medicine and healthcare, and then it kind of developed into a cluster, one thing after another. But other foreign governments are also creating design clusters. And this would be like in Lyon, where they have a large amount of cluster activity dedicated to chemicals, textile manufacturing, also healthcare. You could also look in Saudi Arabia, where the government has designed different clusters. So there's some choices. So either design clusters or these accidental clusters. Now, generally speaking, clusters favor what we call coopetition. Again, this is when we start looking at the embedded network perspective. Okay? Yes, they compete with each other, but it's also in their interest to cooperate perhaps against players from outside the network or outside the cluster. I mentioned this already, but proximity and familiarity can foster inter-firm cooperation. If your competitors are right there next to you, sometimes it makes more sense to collaborate with them to get a chunk of a growing market than it would to try to beat each other out and let a third party come in and take the business away from you. Additionally, because they're so close, best practices are spread rapidly throughout a cluster. Ideally, this winds up being imitation of best or innovative practices. But also because firms are so close to each other and they start developing greater and greater network ties, this should at least limit opportunistic behaviors. Yes, one firm could always cheat or lie within a network, but there is supposed to be some sort of social control. And being excluded from a cluster could certainly have a high cost. Therefore, it would discourage that kind of behavior. Now, some people think that clusters are declining. Some of it could be because of technological discontinuities. Other people think that it would have to do with a shift in buyers' needs. So, the Silicon Valley way may be great for certain companies and certain firms and certain geographies, but there may be kind of more local needs that don't really match what Silicon Valley has to offer, for example. And of course, a lot of the small firms within a cluster are slowly eroding, and you start having larger and larger firms. They start turning into engaging in, as they kind of get bigger, they cooperate a little too much. Then you have like cartel type behavior, oligopoly type behavior, and then that can lead to a decline in the quality of the governing bodies and regulatory institutions supervising a cluster. And of course, sometimes we talk about spread of innovation and best practices, but that can lead to groupthink, and that's not always a good thing. Next thing we want to look at is cluster dynamics. Generally speaking, actors within the same cluster have common and divergent interests. Now, again, I mentioned that there is a risk of opportunism, and there is a risk that there'll be a loss of focus, and therefore some sort of a declining commitment of certain actors. It certainly can result, but at least in theory, there is some sort of social norms going on in the cluster to prevent loss of opportunism and also to prevent this loss of focus and declining commitment. Again, the criticism of these clusters would be that, yes, they should be embedded organizations, but they start kind of shifting towards discrete organizations. That's kind of what I'm describing here. And of course, certain actors within a cluster have different weights and bargaining powers. Of course, we talked about this in the five forces model. Silicon Valley, certain microchip manufacturers may be suppliers that are extremely powerful, and they can crush certain software development firms, for example. So the choices and orientations of a cluster, unfortunately, tend to reflect the most powerful or engaged actors' interests. So to sum up cluster management in a nutshell, governing bodies of clusters, which are usually cities, but they can also be kind of informal or formal councils, like Better Business Bureau, Chamber of Commerce, kind of these peak associations, which I talk about in my business and politics module if you're more interested in that. But these bodies have to be legitimate and equidistant from the different actors. They can't favor one actor or another. And this is important because they have to ensure that they are reminding and promoting the different groups within a cluster of the common overarching goals of a cluster. And as Gerlach is known for saying, Networks rely neither on the visible nor invisible hand-to-guide relationships, but on the continuous handshake. So again, it's always kind of a trust and a mutually negotiated kind of relationship. They have to balance the different stakeholders' interests, but they should also be aware that too much compromise can result in solutions that make everybody angry. Then they also have to make sure that they punish opportunistic behaviors within the cluster. And of course, the actors themselves must make sure that they are indispensable to the overall cluster activity, so make sure that they are valuable to everyone else, but they don't want to become over-specialized, because then that can also make them vulnerable. So have your niche, but don't become so niche that you can't do anything else. Be dispensable, but, be indispensable, but don't become over-specialized. Great. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion of network strategy, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in my next module.